Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Chandran Kukathas, and we're going to talk about immigration. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you for asking.
All right, so you recently wrote a book on immigration, and I was hoping that you could summarize the argument in the book.
Sure. So the book is called Immigration and Freedom. And I think it's distinctive because while most books dealing with immigration from a normative point of view focus on the issue of whether or not states have the right to exclude or whether or not immigration controls are bad for would-be immigrants, or whether immigration policy is harmful to people within society for various reasons having to do with economics, the labor market, and so on. I try to argue that central to the question of immigration from a moral point of view should be the question of freedom. And an underappreciated aspect of the impact of immigration control on freedom is its impact on the freedom of citizens rather than of immigrants. And the reason for this is that immigration control, while it looks like it's directed primarily at would-be immigrants, preventing them from entering a country or preventing them from entering the workforce if they do enter a country. In fact, what immigration controls do is they limit the ability of citizens and residents to interact with immigrants, because the point of immigration control is not actually to control border crossing, it's actually to control what people do once they've crossed the border. And if you're going to control outsiders, then you have to control insiders as well, because insiders, citizens and residents, are all too ready to engage with outsiders, immigrants and would-be immigrants, in which case what you end up with is a system of increasing surveillance, regulation, restriction, punishment, which has an adverse effect on the people within a country. So that's really the focus of the book. And since it's quite a long book, it's really a detailed exploration of the nature of this control and the implications that it has for freedom. So it's as much a theory of freedom as it is a theory of the impact of immigration controls.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah, I've never really heard that argument before, so I think this is a different perspective. So, can you give me examples of the type of control of like impositions of our freedom that would take place if we were to be more strict about immigration?
Okay, well, let me start with some fairly simple and almost, I would say, innocuous controls. Um, since immigrants or would-be immigrants can't be distinguished by, on sight from citizens and residents, if you're going to control immigration, say, for example, through border crossing, you have to stop everyone. Now, of course, we're used to this, but just the logic is fairly straightforward. If you want to control people crossing your borders, you've got to control everybody. Everybody's got to be stopped. Everybody's got to show their passport. Everybody's got to prove that they have a right to cross. So that's at the in the very first instance. Secondly, if you're going to control what people do once they've crossed the border, and let's say there's a chance that they might enter the labor market, you can impose restrictions on immigrants, but in order to make these stick, you've actually got to then control your residents to the extent that they might want to employ them. So you're going to have extensive controls on employers. You've got to have inspections, you've got to have penalties, you've got to have punishments, and so on. And this is a limitation on the freedom of would-be employers, which is in some ways difficult to justify because you're punishing people for simply wanting to engage in trade with others. Why should this be a subject of restriction? But it is. Now, there are various arguments that you might make for doing this, notably the effect of this on third parties, others who might be otherwise employed by employers in the country. But here also you've got to ask the question, why is it that we think that it's okay to limit the freedom of employers to engage in trade in this way? Why is it that somehow people who are domestic or internal members, who are citizens or residents, why is it that we think they have an entitlement to be employed over and against or over and above people from outside the country? Do they have a right to these jobs? Do these jobs belong to them in some way? And I suspect not. So this is another way in which immigration controls impact on the freedom of citizens and residents. Another example I could give you is the impact these controls have even on people who want to do something relatively innocuous, like have a mother or mother-in-law or father-in-law visit because they happen to be non-residents or non-citizens of a country. They face the risk in countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, the risk of deportation if they babysit, because it's against the law for them to accept any kind of employment, even unpaid. Now, this is actually a case that's not anomalous. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of this happening all the time. So I could continue to give you more and more examples of the way in which immigration controls limit the freedom of people within this society. To give you, just to finish off this this observation with one fairly dramatic case. So between 1930 and 2000, roughly speaking, the United States deported 2 million people. 1 million of those were American citizens, not just residents, but actually American citizens. Obviously, they did not mean to deport them, but at various stages, when the imperative to control immigration became greater, it became necessary, or at least the government thought so, to take greater and greater measures to reduce or slow immigration. The deportation regulations were modified, police were given greater and greater powers, and 1 million Americans were deported from their own country. And by the way, this still goes on all the time. We don't have firm figures on this, but we know that it is the case for a fact, not just in the United States, but in Australia and in the European Union. And we also know that even as we speak, there are probably tens of thousands of Americans and Europeans who are detained by their own governments because they've been unable to prove that they are citizens, even though they are. They will be released, but this is a case of harms visited upon citizens by immigration controls.
Okay, thank you for that. So I want to focus on a couple of examples that you mentioned. One was the innocuous restriction or regulation, and the other the not so innocent one. So the first thing that you mentioned was border control, right? If you want to control the flow of people coming into your country, you have to stop everybody. Yeah, and that's what happens, right? Okay, but that seems to be all right. So permissible. Now, the second example that you pointed out was the imposition that the government basically has on its own citizens to hire, restricting the hiring of these immigrants, right? And so that is not just a harm, or it not only disadvantages the immigrants themselves, it also disadvantages the employers, like or in my case, the American employers, because they want to hire these immigrants, right? Usually because these immigrants are willing to work for less money. And so there is some sort of a contractual agreement, right, that both parties will gain from this interaction. And you're saying, okay, well, why should the government be able to prevent that from happening, right? If these employers can't hire these immigrants, and basically what we're saying is that these employers should be forced to hire other Americans. But why should that be the case? Is the government justified in doing that? Are these other Americans entitled to these jobs by American employers? And yeah, so I think those are good questions. I've interviewed a couple of libertarians, and I know libertarians tend to be more pro-immigration, and they make very similar arguments, right? They don't think that a person being a citizen necessarily means that they're entitled to these advantages over an immigrant, because the fact that you're a citizen is morally arbitrary, right? So are you coming at it from a libertarian perspective as well?
I'm not trying to come at it from a libertarian perspective, although obviously I'm very sympathetic to the libertarian point of view, especially on this question. But I don't think you need to take a strong libertarian view to see the point that I'm trying to make here. If one is not libertarian, but thinks that the laws should protect the interests of the citizens of a country, that may be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The question then becomes, well, is immigration control something that is of advantage to the citizens of a country, or is it something that is harmful to them? And I want to suggest that what really is going on is that these controls do advantage some citizens, but they also harm others. So the question is, why should one accept these controls if they benefit some but harm others? And to my mind, what's not been given sufficient attention is the extent to which there is harm to others. Um, uh, and why it is that governments or states are justified in picking and choosing which of its citizens it's going to advantage. Now, in the case of the labor market, it's not as if, let's say, take the United States, American policy is somehow systematically advantaging the least well-off in society, because firstly, there's simply no evidence that this is true overall. If anything, in the long term or even in the medium term, many people who are poorer are harmed by these immigration controls. Some are harmed because they will miss out on employment opportunities because governments have put their emphasis elsewhere. Sometimes this will depend simply on which employers are more powerful, because employers sometimes lobby governments to place immigration restrictions that will affect their rivals so that they will be better off. So it advantages those employers and then some employees as a result, but a whole lot of other people are harmed. What is the justification for this? In the end, I can't really see a systematic justification for this. So I don't want to deny that no one ever loses out by immigration control, but I also want to point out that many people will lose out if you if you have immigration control. Again, I think this is something that's underappreciated.
Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that you're approaching it from some sort of like deontological perspective. You're not saying like, look, these people have a freedom to immigrate. Like immigrants have the freedom to immigrate. Employers have the right to employ whoever they want. It's not necessarily about that, or is it?
No, I'm not trying to rest it on any very strong claims about, let's say, the rights of employers or the rights of immigrants or the rights that people have generally. I'm really just trying to appeal to some, I think, fairly basic intuitions that we all have. I think most people think, yes, if you're going to limit somebody's freedom, there had better be a pretty good justification for it. Maybe a very strong justification has to be given to the person whose freedom is in fact limited. But you also need to, give some justification to those whose freedoms are affected indirectly. And my concern here is that what's not been taken into account is the extent to which these freedoms are in fact limited or restricted without any good justification. So a lot of the book does take seriously utilitarian arguments that say, well, what we're doing is we're going to, let's say, if we take the economics of immigration, we're going to improve the well-being of the poorest in society. We're going to increase the likelihood that overall welfare will increase, and so on. I'm prepared to look very carefully at those arguments and look at the empirical evidence, because that would be something we want to take into consideration. If allowing open immigration or much more open immigration had terrible consequences, then we should think again about this. But what I've tried to suggest is that there isn't really this evidence that's there. It's not going to improve the workings of the labor market. It's not going to help the poorest members of society, and it is going to harm an awful lot of people whose freedom will be lost, and in some cases, whose livelihoods will be limited.
So, isn't one of the main arguments in favor of some sort of immigration control that we want to protect American wages or the, native wages? We don't want the wages to go down so much. What do you have to
That
say?
is an argument that's often made, not just in the United States, but also in Britain and the European Union. And and once again, there's pretty much a consensus amongst economists that the impact on wages is very, very limited, if it is in fact a negative. Of course, in some cases, some wages might go down if people in some labor markets are competing directly with other immigrants or with immigrant labor. But on the other hand, there are also cases where the influx of immigrants makes certain industries viable, which makes it possible for domestic workers to be hired in a way that wouldn't have been the case otherwise. So on the whole, the evidence that's there suggests that there isn't a significant impact of immigration control on improving the wages of the poorest. Of course, there are numerous studies conducted on this all the time. They don't all say exactly the same thing, but none of them suggest that there's a dramatic impact on wages. Some may say that it's a slightly positive, some may say it's a slightly negative impact. But even the most strong advocates of immigration control would admit that when it comes to the economics, the impact of immigration control is pretty minimal.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this topic, but did a little bit of reading on it, and it seemed that almost every study that I found that the conclusion was that immigration it benefits the host country economically. And
Mhm.
I was like, oh, okay. Well, I mean, like that's a pretty strong that's pretty strong evidence that that's true. Of all these different studies conclude the same thing, right? And yet you have a lot of people who are pretty anti-immigration, or at least they want severe restrictions on immigration, and I think they highlight illegal immigration, right? I think the people who are more in the middle and politically, they say like I'm okay with immigrants. I just don't like illegal immigrants. I don't like all this illegal immigration coming across the border. What do you have to say about that?
Okay, so I guess firstly, I'd point out that the notion of an illegal immigrant is a relatively recent invention. If you go back to the early part of the 20th century, or even the middle of it, you wouldn't find this term, even though there was still a history of immigration restriction, deportation, and so on. So the notion of an illegal immigrant is a relatively recent thing. And it's more a reflection of, I think, the extent to which the issue has become increasingly politicized and immigration has been increasingly legalized. That is to say, more and more movement across borders requires getting a visa. As there are more and more restrictions on people moving, those who want to move for a variety of reasons will still move, but now they will end up being classified as illegal. This, of course, then generates resentment because, again, everywhere politicians will look to pointing this out and then looking to take advantage of this, electorally. But the impact of the illegal immigrants is no different from the impact of legal immigrants. What's creating more illegal immigrants is laws making it harder and harder for people to move. Moving, whether it's as a refugee or moving as someone who's seeking economic opportunity or seeking family reunification. The more you limit this, the more you encourage people to move illegally. In the case of the United States, it's also worth bearing in mind that you think about the southern border in particular, and this is where most of the illegal crossing takes place, as against a century ago, when most of the illegal crossing took place through Canada because people wanted to get into the United States without authorization, would go to Canada and try to cross the border. Now it's coming up through Mexico. one of the things that has made this more and more of a problem is simply the fact that it's harder and harder for people to migrate legally. But also, it's because there has been more than a century and a half of ordinary border crossings between the United States and Mexico, really for 150 years. A lot of it for employment. People would head down from the United States to find workers and bring them back. People in those parts of Central America are not going to distinguish carefully between those who are coming in to take them to work legally and those who are coming in to smuggle them across. I don't exaggerate this. There's plenty of smuggling going on, and people know what's happening and so on. But what I want to suggest is that there's a long history of this, and it's the history that's telling us why there is this influx of so-called illegal immigrants.
Okay. Another concern that I hear from people who are more, who want to restrict immigration more is they're okay with immigration. They're okay with these immigrants coming in as long as they're the good kind, right? And they'll make a
Mhm.
distinction between the good kind of immigrants who are perhaps more educated or perhaps can contribute something to our society versus the bad kind who they perceive as maybe less educated, less capable, and who will be an overall drain on the American
Mhm.
society. What do you have to say about that?
But firstly, overall, immigrants turn out to be beneficial to the society that they enter. For the most part, they are people who are already at least young adults or adults. You don't have to incur the cost of educating them. You don't have to incur the cost of paying for them to acquire skills. They also come with a very, very strong motivation to work and get ahead. And indeed, all the evidence is that, in fact, especially among the poorest and most desperate of immigrants, they're the most likely ones to actually start up businesses, become successes, and make good. It's on the whole, very much an asset to countries to have immigrants coming in. So the argument that you want to have only the good kind depends a little bit on the idea that, well, what you can do is you can somehow pick and choose and decide who is going to be the most valuable, the most successful. I think the reality is we actually don't know. People have skills and qualifications you can identify, but what you can't identify is determination, drive, a work ethic, a wish to succeed. So if you're going to try to pick and choose and just get the good immigrants, well, I'd say good luck with that. But my guess is that at best, what you'll end up is just a random group of people, some of whom will be successful and some of whom will not. You will not do better than just taking your chances.
Yeah, I've had some conversations with conservatives on the internet about this issue, right? And they're like, yeah, we want the good kind. And I'm just like, well, what does that mean, And they were coming at it from the perspective of like, look, let's say that you own a company, right? And you want to hire new employees for your company. You're not just going to hire anybody, right? You're going to hire the person who's qualified. And immigration should be the same way. You want the immigrant that's going to contribute to your country that is a company. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure how they're going to do that. Maybe one way that they would do that is to see if the immigrant is educated, maybe.
Mhm. Well, I'll give you an anecdote about a Nobel Prize winner who was approached by a sperm bank for donations. Um, the letter said they were looking for very, very eminent people because they wanted to be able to produce more and more high-powered, highly valuable people, and they're going to sell this product, obviously. And this Nobel Prize winner wrote back and said, well, his father was a janitor and his mother worked in a factory, and he became a Nobel Prize winner. He himself had produced two children, one of whom was unemployed and the other was an indifferent musician. So if you really want to find a couple of good sperm donors, they should go and look for a janitor and a factory worker, because in his experience, that will give you better luck. Now, obviously, he was being facetious, but the point is there. We have no idea, who's going to be a success. We can make some judgments. Someone with a criminal record is probably someone you don't want. Someone who's got a long record of unemployment and general listlessness. If you could identify that person, it may not be a good bet. But someone who's determined to come to a country, taking a huge risk, probably leaving all their capital behind, other than their human capital, they're probably the sort of person you really want.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with what you're saying. There is some sort of the fact that they're immigrants they're like a self-selected group, right? They're the ones who are motivated enough to travel all those ways to enter a country to seek a better life. Those are the people with drive, right? And that's really what you
Yeah,
want. I mean, trying to judge their worthiness by the level of education that they obtained. I think that's like, I don't know, that's more of a weak proxy. It's almost like the process of immigrating to another country in the way that they do is like an obstacle course, right? And
yeah,
like so,
yeah,
and they've all gone through this obstacle course, so it's like,
yeah,
I guess it'd be an idea of like their character because they're willing
yeah.
to, walk all those thousands of miles. All right, so the other issue that I wanted to bring up with this is this idea of cultural cohesion and perhaps a cultural identity, which is another criticism or another value that I think some conservatives have that they think immigration threatens, right? They seem to want some one unifying, cohesive, at least in my case, again, American identity, right? And they don't want that culture to disappear. They don't want that national cohesion to weaken via immigration. And what do you have to say about that?
There are a few things. I guess first thing, I make an obvious point is that even if not a single new person enters the United States as an immigrant, this identity that we have in the United States today is going to be transformed. It's going to be transformed because the United States is not a closed society. It's not like, say, Tibet, or it's not a little Amish community. It's a vibrant, internationalized society made up of 350 million people with different views, and we have no idea which kind of way of thinking is going to dominate, whether we're thinking in religious terms or cultural terms or anything. We don't know what people are going to invent. We don't know what people are going to um, find that they discover a liking for. So the society is going to change. If you have a very small amount of immigration, or you have a very large amount of immigration, the society is going to change. Just think about, what an American from 1850 would have made of an American in 1950, and what an American in 1950 would have made of an American now. I mean, I say an American, I'm not even um, um, sure that there is such a thing as an American, except to the extent that you just took one at random. There are so many different kinds of Americans. So the country is going to change, as is Europe, as is Singapore, as is Australia. Nothing we can really do about it. And I think anyone who thinks that they're really going to control the shape of the country is very, very optimistic. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, if you did think you're going to be able to control the character of the country, or the cultural values, or the cultural nature of the country, the thing you've got to do, especially in a country like the United States, but also in Europe and Britain and so on, is actually have some idea about what is that identity. Because in a society that's as diverse as the United States, with people of different religious denominations, people with different cultural traditions, people who are rural versus people who are urban, people who are cosmopolitan, as opposed to those who are much more small town community minded. They're all different. Which version is it that you want to preserve? And if you say it's one particular kind, then you're automatically saying to your other fellow citizens, we are going to replace you with a different kind of person, because this is the the actual kind of person we want to have being kind of an American. But let's say the conservatives said something like, no, 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 we're not going to, do that. We accept that there is diversity. What we want is to preserve a society of Americans, but recognizing that they're all different. Okay? Well, if that's the case, if there's no particular identity that you want to preserve, why is immigration going to be a problem? I mean, unless you're going to have an immigration policy that admitted people disproportionately from one very, very narrow kind of way of living, you're going to get a diversity of people coming in, adding to the already existing diversity that's there now. So you've got a hard choice to make. If you want to really preserve some kind of identity that you're aware of, then you're going to have to suppress the identities of a lot of your fellow citizens. If you're not willing to do that, and you're therefore, willing to let the chips fall where they may, there's no reason to limit immigration, at least not for this reason, because it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that some people fear one of the possibilities that you mentioned, which I actually think is unlikely, but this is what they fear, right? Where there's going to be a disproportionate immigration from a particular culture, and then so that culture is eventually going to be dominant. And the fear is that that culture doesn't share the same values as Americans do. So perhaps they don't value freedom of speech. Perhaps they don't value equality between the sexes. And so if there are too many of those people here, then they're going to change the laws and then the country is going to become illiberal, right?
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
Again, I guess the thing I would ask for is some evidence on this. Okay, right now is presented as a strong possibility, but there's absolutely no evidence for this, that this is actually going to be the kind of transformation that you would see. Why would those coming into the country transform the country rather than be themselves transformed by this? If you think about, let's say, um, uh, take a kind of ethnic group that's been coming to the United States for a very long time, the Chinese. There are many, many Chinese, as I'm sure you're aware, in the United States. Most of them are simply Americans. Of course, they've held on to some of their traditions to varying degrees, but lots of them have also totally abandoned that inheritance and see themselves largely as Americans. The same would be true of Italians and Poles and French and Russians, even though, you'll find enclaves of all of these cultures in the United States. The same could be said of, let's say Vietnamese immigrants to Australia or Greek immigrants to Australia. They're totally absorbed into the society. They haven't turned Australia into little Greece or little Italy or little China, let alone transformed it into something more deeply culturally different.
Yeah, in my experience, in my observations, the first generation of immigrants, so like the immigrants themselves, I mean, they're going to hold on to, traditions, their native languages, and they're most likely going to socialize with others of their own group, and for those reasons, right? So when immigrant communities, they tend to live together. They tend to self segregate, right? So I'm from Los Angeles, and that's exactly what you see. And that I think only lasts for one generation, in my experience, right? Their
Mhm.
kids will assimilate much more than the parents, you know. So the street that I grew up on, there were a lot of other neighborhood kids. I was very lucky, so I got to play with, other kids around my age. But, we were like pretty diverse, right? There was like my best friend, two houses down, he's like Filipino, right? Another one who was, he was Chinese, another one was Indian, another Filipino, a couple of Portuguese people over here, and we all play together, and it's not like we had to speak English with each other, right? There was no way for us all to communicate speaking anything else, right? So I almost feel like because due to a diverse society, you will naturally like the kids of the immigrants will naturally assimilate. Like they're going to learn the languages, they're going to adopt the customs, they're going to adopt the values, right? Because they're going to go to those schools, right? So I feel like the fear that some people have towards immigrants, that fear is a little overblown because of the temporarily limited I guess the concerns that they have, right? It's only going to be there for like one generation. But I guess the concern would still be there if there was like constant immigration, right? So there's always going to be first generation immigrants that come into the country. At the same time, there's going to be like second and third generation immigrants, second and third generation Americans being born. So it's going to be this constant dynamic flow of people and movement of people. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So let me give you an example of public policy that that operates at one level on the assumption that immigrants are going to transform the country and so therefore need to be controlled, but at the other level operates on the assumption that the reverse will happen and that immigrants will be absorbed, okay, and will change. The Australian government, but it's not alone in this, it's true of many governments around the world. The Australian government operates a program through which it essentially propagandizes to areas like the Middle East and Afghanistan and Indonesia, where they think people will be coming from, uh, to say to them, if you come to Australia, you will find that your culture will be transformed, your children will adopt Australian ways. They won't live by your tradition ways. They won't dress the same way. They won't be like you. Okay? So this is the propaganda that is waged quite deliberately and through government policy, working with some of the governments in Afghanistan before the Taliban, working with governments in the Middle East and Indonesia to give this message. And in fact, a long time ago, back in around 2000, I was on the National Multicultural Advisory Council reporting to the Minister for Immigration. We were told to write a report on multiculturalism in Australia, and we did, explaining why being diverse and welcoming of other cultures was a valuable thing and why the government was promoting it. At the same time, the government was running this campaign to tell people the reverse of what we were trying to promote as a part of government policy. I consequently resigned from the council in protest, as did some other members. But the point here is that you can't say both of these things simultaneously. Say we're worried about immigrants coming in because they're going to change the culture, and then mount campaigns saying to would-be immigrants, if you come, you will be transformed. You won't be changing us. You will be transformed. And I think that's really, something that people in countries like Australia and Switzerland, another case that does these campaigns, they understand that in the end these people will be absorbed. They will change things to some degree, but for the most part, they themselves will be changed. And I think most people who want to move accept this because they're not, unaware of the magnitude of the decision they're taking. If you're from Malaysia as I was and you move to Australia, it's going to be different. It's not something that will come as a surprise to you. The language will be different. The customs will be different. The food will be different. Everything will be different. And therefore, that you're going to change. And when I moved to Australia at the age of 12, my father told me, it's going to be different.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if I were to move to Germany and have a kid there, I'm going to assume my kid is going to grow up speaking German. He's going to go to German school and he's
Yeah.
going to make these German friends, right? And he's going to adopt German customs and stuff like that. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yes.
So one thing that has been pretty popular on the news, well, not popular, but it's like widely discussed on the news, is these Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, which is actually not
Yes,
too far
yes.
away from where I live. It's about 45 minutes from where I live. And so I mean, there are tensions, okay, between some of the locals and the Haitian immigrants. So I don't want to invalidate the locals' concerns because I think there are some legitimate questions regarding government benefits and government assistance. So I think a lot of people think that the American government should prioritize American citizens when it comes to government assistance and welfare and stuff like that. And they don't like it when these Haitian immigrants also get government assistance because they see it as almost like they are taking something away from them. What do you think about that?
So, in the case of the Haitians in Springfield, um, as I follow the case, the biggest reason why so many of them have moved to that part of the country is for job opportunities, and the opportunities were there because in Springfield, employers couldn't find the labor that they needed. There was, in fact, a labor shortage. Now, if that's the case, then actually the Haitians are supplying a benefit, even if it's the case that some of them are on welfare. I don't know the details of this, so I can't comment authoritatively. But in the end, if people are employed and they're paying taxes and they're saving, it means that they're going to be net contributors. Or if you just think of it in more straightforward economic terms, if someone's willing to pay a Haitian, just as if they're willing to pay anybody, they're getting more than they're paying. Then, because otherwise, why would you pay something? You must be getting more than you think you're losing. In this case, losing in terms of income. Same for the Haitians. They wouldn't work unless the money that they are getting is worth more to them than their labor. So mutual exchange is mutually beneficial. And to that extent, everybody is better off. So I don't see what the problem is. I could see why there might be one if, let's say, these people were coming in and displacing other workers, or if there was a significant impact on wages in this part of the country. But from what I've seen, that isn't the nature of the problem. I can appreciate people being concerned about their tax dollars going to helping other people. Here, I think Americans differ. Some of them would want only Americans to benefit. There are other Americans who are happy to share, what they have with people anywhere. I mean, think of just the number of Americans who send money abroad for charitable donations, who help people regardless of their nationality, as is their right. I'm not sure why anybody should resent those people doing what they want with their money, and why they should resent at least some of the tax dollars going in the direction of people that some Americans would support. I'm not sure that anybody should have a veto on this, unless all Americans were of the same view, which they're not. Then okay, I think one could debate this, but I think Americans have different views.
Yeah, it's hard for me not to believe that what is part of this anti-immigrant sentiment is xenophobia. It's hard for me not to believe that. And the reason why is because when I look at the arguments against immigration, they just don't seem to hold water. The
Mhm.
economic concerns, those do not seem to be convincing at all. Almost every study that I see points the opposite direction, that immigrants are good for the economy. When it comes to crime, every study that I've seen so far says that immigrants commit fewer crimes than Native Americans or American citizens. So I think it's closely tied to perhaps not a explicit or conscious belief, but some sort of like subconscious belief that these type of immigrants are somehow inferior, right? So I remember seeing this video. It was, I think, a group of Indian people smashing coconuts on the road. Okay. And I think they were in maybe like Paris or something. They were in some Western country. And a lot of the people said pretty xenophobic comments, right? Stuff like, "Oh, this is what happens when you import third world people. You get their third world ways." And I think that is part of the concern. It's not just that the culture is going to change is that the culture is going to change in a bad way because these people are inferior, because they're just less intelligent or they're uncivilized, they're barbarians. Do you get this impression as well?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I don't want to dispute that there are people who hold such views, but I don't think it's the decisive factor here. I mean, you've mentioned that there are, numerous studies on the economics of immigration and on various other topics, which suggest that people should not have the prejudices that they do. But I think it's not so much. Xenophobia, at least not in a generalized form, as people being unaware of the reality. And for good reason. That is that I think political leaders everywhere, if they think they can gain an advantage by, in this case, talking up the anti-immigrant sentiment, they will do so. So they will say things that are misleading, maybe even things that they don't believe. I mean, for example, why would someone like Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance say the things he's saying about immigration when he's himself, married to an immigrant, as is the former president, who is, fully aware of the great diversity of immigrant experience and, immigrant natures. Why would he do that? Well, because the interest in securing office trumps the interest in offering a more nuanced analysis of the impact of immigration. And so what you get are sound bites that convince people of things that maybe once they didn't consider. If you go back to, let's say the early 1980s, when George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan were debating for the nomination, for the Republican nomination for candidate for president, they were both arguing and denouncing the other for not being pro-immigrant enough. This is a generation ago. Okay, why have things changed? It's not that the facts on the ground have changed. It's because at some point the anti-immigrant voice has become stronger, and some people have found that this is going to give them advantage if they can, take heed of this. And I think it's unfortunate. I think the only way to address it is through argument and analysis. But I don't think that xenophobia is going to be the explanation, because the United States didn't suddenly become xenophobic, over the course of a generation.
No, I appreciate that perspective. I think the reason why you think that is, again, again, this whole Haitian immigrant thing. I mean, the reason why that even became so talked about in the news was because of these claims that these Haitian immigrants were eating people's cats and dogs, right? They're eating people's pets. And that I feel like w would attract a lot of attention and trigger a lot of people because we love our pets, right? And who
Mhm.
would eat cats and dogs? Only barbarians would. So I felt like
Mhm.
there was this close connection between, no, not only are they different, not only are they immigrants, is that they are uncivilized, right? And
Mhm.
that's why it got so heated. And I don't want to say that there was something special that happened in this, in the last generation that just made America xenophobic. Like I agree with you. I don't think it's that, but it's almost like there's this evolutionarily, like I don't know, like this product of evolution that kind of makes us wary of outsiders, right? Like, and we perhaps it's the same reason why we're tribal. And so because that's always part of our natures, the politicians can always lean on that if they feel like that they can get votes that way, right? So it's kind of like what
Mhm.
you said. These certain actors just found a political opportunity to kind of utilize and exploit people's fear of outsiders and things that are foreign.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think this has, been something that's evident in human history. The the inclination to demonize the other if it's to your advantage. There would in European history, the Irish have been accused of all kinds of things, including cannibalism. Jewish people have been accused of, eating babies. I mean, these are actual examples. But I wouldn't want to say from these sorts of cases that, Europe, there's a huge groundswell of anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe that is the reason behind all of this. I think the reasons behind these sorts of things are probably more prosaic. It has to do with particular people looking to gain an advantage by demonizing some people and stirring up anxiety in the population. If telling people that Haitians eat cats doesn't do it, they'll stop saying it and they'll find some other thing to say. They'll just try out different things. They're not interested in evidence or arguments. They've got an agenda. I don't think this is ever going to change. I think the other thing that's not going to change is that there are some people who are gullible, and the other thing that's not going to change is some people are going to get skittish. They're going to at least at first believe some of these stories and get worried. Put their cats inside and investigate before they let them out. It's all silly, but it takes all kinds to make up the world, and I think some people are prone to believing these stories.
All right, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/ChianPhilosophy.